Howdy, Russ.
Hey, Roger. How's it going? You underwater there from the hydrologic
No, man,
yeah.
it's like most of the stuff is south of us.
Ah, that's
Um, there's been a little bit of puddling in the streets, but nothing dire and no consistent rain. It's just this sort of rains a little bit and then it stops and blah 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 blah.
yeah,
What
yeah.
about you?
Kind of the same. I think it's hit Northern Cal more, or like San Francisco. Sounds like they've really
Yeah, that sounds like a disaster, doesn't it?
does. Hey, Kara, good morning.
Good morning.
I presume you got Borsica's email, or I don't know. So I guess it's you and me winging it along here to start with, and then she'll join us in process.
That sounds great. Let me pull up the slides and then we can wait to get started for everyone to join in. But I'll pull up the slides on the back end.
That's perfect. If you can, one thing that you might want to do fairly soon is put the nice whatever mini abbreviated link to the presentations at the meeting itself. Put that in chat. I know you did a nice job of sending it out and we've got it on the slides, but people could start having that available. I think that might help.
Sounds good. Yes, I can get that.
Thanks. Welcome, people. Happy 2023. Those of you we haven't interacted with yet. We're going to wait just a couple more minutes for people to join so we don't have to go over things three times. I think many of you that I know, looks like maybe I know about half of you, are good chat users, but we do want to, for there's some of you that haven't been on this before, we do make active use of chat. So please feel free to use that, as well as we're going to have a lot of this verbal sharing and things today. So please do both of those things. And just one more heads up. I think we'll wait just one more minute. For those of you on now, if you haven't had a chance to look yet at the agenda, or it isn't totally obvious what Kara just put in here, the main topic for today is to kind of debrief and just share what we heard at the D&I meeting related to adaptations and fidelity. There was quite a bit. I think an increasing amount, but this is a great link that Kara has done. What it'll do is take you to a document that has hot links that list all the things, at least from a quick summary, well, maybe not so quick, that she went through and colleagues went through, find out things related to adaptations at the meeting. And then it's a hot link, so you can go back to either remind yourself or check out for later use what the presentations were. So Danielle just asked Kara, and I probably jumped the gun a bit, but I wanted people to. So maybe if you could wait and try it again while you're sharing screen in just 2 more minutes to share. Oh, you did it again already. Never mind, you're as usual ahead of me. So why don't we go ahead and get started? Borsika is going to be a little late joining us. She's had something come up. So we're going to get started so we don't waste all of your time who are here by now. But this is our first January kickoff for this. So we're going to run over Kara, who I asked to introduce herself in just a moment. And I are going to just run over a few things. And then, as you can see, the primary topic today is going to be the next to last one there, just to talk about what did we take away, what was interesting, what was provocative, what issues do you think we might want to follow up on for later discussion in this group. So, Kara, if you could do the next slide, please. Okay. So again, we've had some, I don't know, logistical administrative changes. I do want to emphasize very much that the VA is still very involved here. Christine, her group, many other people, I noticed David Goodrich is on, are still part of this. We're still part of the overall IRG group for this, but the kind of hosting of it has been taken over by a combination of the great UCSD team here and my group at Colorado. And much of it, if there's anything you like in here, it's most likely due to Kara Swanson, who I'm going to have introduce herself in a moment. But we're switching here, but the theme, the content is the same. It's just the contacts and things here will be those of us on this screen rather than Christine Kowalski being the primary contact. But again, this is open to anybody, VA, non-VA, US. We'd love to get some more international people, but the broader the perspective we can get, the better. So with that, Kara, do you want to just say a word or two and introduce yourself?
Yeah, I would love to. Thank you so much. So my name is Kara Swanson. I have been working in the implementation world since about 2015 when I started at the National Center for PTSD Dissemination, Implementation, and Training Division in Menlo Park. And since then, I worked on a number of different projects looking at evaluation and adaptation of different evidence-based practices. So I'm now currently the manager of DISC at UCSD. And so I'm very excited to be a part of this work group. I was a member, now I'm very excited to be kind of on the back end to help coordinate our future meetings and any other events we have going on.
Fantastic. Welcome. It's just been incredible having Kara join us and both her proactive ideas. You'll see some of those in a minute, as well as just organization has really helped. So if you do have logistical issues, please reach out to Kara and myself. If you have content issues and suggestions, why don't you copy all three of us that are listed here. And with that, let's go to the next slide. So just a few updates here. We are still talking about a few options for February. So please, again, this would be one thing, email all of us, Kara, Borsika, myself. You can try and put it in chat also, but it might help to have a confirming email because Kara and I are both multitasking here. But for March, we do have an exciting, we think, discussion about context and adaptations and implementation here that we hope you can all make. We'll put out well in advance what the February topic is. And right here is either a QR code or a link here. If you can put in there about nominations, please do not be bashful at all about putting in your own nomination for yourself. And I want to emphasize also, the purpose of this group is really to have exchange and sharing about things. So you don't have to have like a published article or a totally done study or whatever. Some of the most fun, productive discussions are just kind of sharing what's going on, including kind of some of our challenges or where we're scratching our head. So don't feel it has to be a fully formed, finished project for there, but we really, really would appreciate and need your input so we can tailor it to you. So with that, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so we're going to be, again, the main topic today is debriefing and sharing about the DNI meetings. So please be thinking about that. We're just going to go around the horn. And I'd like to start by those of us that were at the meeting just volunteering to talk about one thing to start with. We have time, we'll go more, but if you could just pick out your favorite presentation or issue. Do feel free to chime in if somebody else is presenting one and you'd also like to comment on that. Please do that. We'll try and keep it open. But Kara has put together two incredible resources, I think, here. One of them is this curated list here about presentations, and I encourage you to use that actively during the meeting now. So if you haven't already done the QR code, or look here, you might want to quickly copy that short URL down. And then I'd encourage you to be using that during the meeting. You can hopefully put that out on another screen or whatever and use that when other people are talking about sessions. Secondly, there's an annotated adaptation reading list. We hope can be a living document and things. Apologize, I'm sure we didn't get everything if we missed some of your articles or whatever, but help us contribute to this. But we think this will be a really nice resource going forward. So I'm going to pause one more minute to let people do those things, particularly the top one, to engage in that, to use as kind of a resource as we go on. But Kara, is there anything else that I haven't mentioned before we just open it up for discussion that we want to do?
I think you've covered everything. I am reposting the different links with their description in the chat. So, and we will be sending out copies of these slides so that you guys will be able to access these links at a later date too.
Perfect. And I'm just doing one more scan here to see who is, primarily if Borsika is on yet, and it doesn't look like she's been able to join us yet. She will do that in process. If you weren't on a little earlier when we start, I really want to encourage everybody to use chat. I think this group is really great at that to facilitate the discussion. But what we're going to do is just go around the horn to pick out one thing that you saw at the meeting. For those of you that were there, if you weren't at the meeting, feel free to ask a question about some of the sessions that you can find on the links provided there. But again, anything there that like maybe sparked a question, you thought was interesting, provocative, etc. And again, the only thing I'd add to this slide here is if there's something that you'd really recommend that we follow up on in this group, either the content and or the presenter that you think might be nice to invite or to have us address. And let's see, if I can, let's try and use, we have a number of people. Can we try and use the hand thing? I'm trying to get my view options so I can see everybody at the same time, but please feel free to raise your hand, or to start with, so they don't see this, just go ahead, anybody that would want to chime in and share what particular session, just to quickly summarize a session that that you were at, you'd like to talk about. Well, this
Hi,
group,
everyone. I can start, Russ.
thanks, Danielle. I appreciate it. I was afraid Kara and I were going to have to think about a joke or something for a minute to get us started. But please take it away.
Well, I still want to hear that joke, but I'll start. I really enjoyed this presentation at the DNI meeting by Aaron Lyon, who's at University of Washington and runs the Alacrity Center. And they really focused on adaptation at the beginning, like taking an existing intervention, adapting it to fit a different population's needs, and using human-centered design testing to do that. And they're like, the quote that I wrote down from the talk was how to do adaptation better. And they use this, I've heard of the system usability scale, but they've created a intervention usability scale, which I thought was really relevant for my work because I'm working on adapting an intervention currently. And yeah, and they focus on the form versus function as well, and looking at what adaptations are being made to the function and the form, and classifying those. So they did this coding, consensus coding, to understand what adaptations they're making to interventions and if they were more effective.
Thank you. That's a great way, nice summary, but informative to talk with. Just a couple things there, but first let me just check with Kara. Kara, is that the specific session that Danielle was talking about, or is that a general URL you put in?
That is the general URL, but I can definitely see if I can pull the specific session URL.
Well, you're doing so much, so we don't ask you to triple task. Maybe we could just ask whoever is talking about that, if you have it on that link, if you could either share it in chat or at least tell us what day it was. Kara's organized things by the day, and we can look for that so other people can comment or get a little more from what the abstract. This link is to the abstracts. So anybody just chime in if you'd like to follow up on what Danielle said, or if you were at this session or you had comments about Aaron Lyon's session. Well, I'll just mention a couple of things as we get ready to shift to somebody else then. And that is, you mentioned, I concur. I think this is this notion of how we can use user or human-centered design or agile design to inform our adaptations, I think is important in a coming area. I'll also share one thing from Borsika that she sent me, since she couldn't join us right away. And she wasn't referring to one particular session, but in general, she noted and said she was personally interested and gratified to see a lot of focus on iterative adaptations and design too. So in addition, not just at the initial planning stage, which is where I think maybe most of the work, at least I've seen, and most of our focus is, but also on an iterative basis going on. And she and her colleagues had a particular session on this to look at coding and what types of adaptation took place at different phases of the project. And she used the VA framework about planning, implementation, and getting ready for sustainment there. And the other thing Danielle mentioned there as part of her description was the form and function. And I think, but I'm not sure, I forget which group has had which presentation, but Monica Yalis has done some great work with Brian Mittman and others around conceptualizing when we think about interventions, and I think it'd work for strategies too, what's the function of, let's say, an adaptation, and then kind of what form can it take, or the specific way. So that might be something worth further discussion at some time as well. So, okay, Kelly, I see you have your hand up, so your turn.
Yeah, thanks, Ross. I think, so I have a more, and I'm very methods oriented, and also in the heart of writing grants in the areas of adaptation and sustainment, and writing papers and designing studies. So I'm very, I was at the D&I conference, and this is not a comment about one specific presentation, but from a methods perspective, and I think also can be looked at as exciting, but opportunities to really advance our work on the science of adaptation, fidelity, and sustainment. So sometimes during a presentation on adaptation, especially a 15-minute presentation on adaptation, there's a sort of trust me approach to trust me. This was an adaptation, even if I'm using form and function, and even if I do a coding process, still feel like at times it's like, well, how how did you know this was an adaptation? You didn't show us the fidelity scale. I don't even know did you use a fidelity scale in this study? So what would be the reference for your adaptation? I think that's one issue for me from a methods perspective is how do you really know it's an adaptation? And then how do you know it's not, if it's an adaptation, not just minutia, but something that matters? And then the other issue is impact of adaptation. So if you don't have a comparison condition, or you don't, that where things weren't adapted in the same way, or you don't have a way of looking at, did this make things better, and empirically testing relationships between adaptation and implementation outcomes or health outcomes, that's really where it gets, when you start working on research, study, writing grants and thinking about how to advance the science of adaptation, that's really where it gets hard, and where it gets like, how do you do that work? And that seems, way forward with advancing our methods in adaptation. And then I think related to that is I would love to see, it's like we've just kind of moved on from fidelity. So we all know it's very challenging to if you're developing your own fidelity measure for a new intervention, or if you're kind of handed this existing fidelity measure that was developed 20 years ago, and maybe it was by a community member, is that up to date with the way we should be evaluating fidelity? So I guess my major takeaway is thinking about, how do we move the field forward and really getting to this, like, what did you really adapt it, really? And then how did you know you adapted? What was kind of the reference? Fidelity, your conceptualization of some core component? Well, how did you get to that? And then how do we get to more movement towards more like empirical testing of these adaptations and the relationship to things like implementation outcomes, sustainment, and health outcomes? Kind of big scientific kind of methods oriented takeaways for me.
Thank you. That's a great frame, I think, not only for the conference, but for maybe you just outlined a number of great topics for us to explore during the year. I personally have struggled with almost all those issues, so I can really relate to them, particularly that issue, I think, about knowing if it's an adaptation and this differentiating kind of what seems a trivial thing versus a real one. And I will say sometimes we've been surprised that some of the things we think are trivial have ended up being pretty impactful later on. So that's it. And then leading into this issue of impact, to me, that's one of the greatest challenges here, especially as you point out. We usually don't have an experimental comparison, nor I would say is it often possible even during interventions, particularly if they're more led by the community or whatever, and they happen so rapidly. But I think it's a huge challenge. And actually, that's one of the things Borsuk and I were thinking about. We might have a specific session on here, just sharing about evaluating impact and what type of impact and what temporal parameters and things like that. So thank you for all of those. And again, fill out your things for what you want to what you want to do here. Going on here, I'm trying to multitask and keep scrolling for hands up. I'm not seeing any. Apologize, I'll keep going if I don't. But I noticed, Connie, you put something in the chat there around related to equity, related adaptation. So would you like to just expand a little bit on that?
Thank you, Russ. I'll sort of casting back to what stood out to me in the conference that that I really wanted to carry with me. And this was a workshop that was focused on developing interventions, which is something I like to think about a lot. So, and true to the, today's issues, we have a lot of interest in looking at how we include an understanding of equity as we design science efforts, activities of any kind. And this one was interesting to me because it called out integrating equity, quality improvement, and implementation science, which allows for a conversation about what are the boundaries between those, which they didn't try to answer, thankfully, because I think that would have been like days in the discussion. Instead, they just said, how do you get a handle on beginning to think about this? which was just right for me in terms of my being relatively new to thinking about how those three issues all overlap and touch each other. And it was pretty exciting to me because they grounded this work, they, in this case, was a biostatistician, PhD, MPH named Rohit Ramaswamy from Cincinnati Children's Hospital, and S. Karen Scott on OBG, who now works separately from academics in a birthing culture rigor LLC that she's developed, and a few other people who are also great to have be on this workshop panel. But essentially, they grounded this in the model of improvement, which is like close to where I started on trying to think about, how do you look at and think about change in healthcare. When they used it as a model of equity and as a model of implementation science, so they cross-referenced all those things, and Dr. Ramaswamy kind of warmed us all up in doing that. And then Dr. Scott sort of added the equity lens and had us think about how do you ground your language and how do you ground your thinking. And I don't want to try to repeat everything she tried to say because that would be impossible, but she then had us all organized as a workshop would be into small groups where we tried to apply what we had learned to a particular situation. And it just got me started thinking, in all the work we do to try to and try to balance all the different needs of science and what we're doing methodologically and what we're doing pragmatically and what we're doing for equity. I think it'll take me a long time to figure it all out and put it together, but they gave me a great start and I really appreciated that.
Well, thank you. That's a really nice reflection. And from my experience, if you think it have it all figured out, you're probably wrong. Or that's kind of boring. So we all need to continue to learn, and I think be flexible and humble about what we're doing, and look for continuing to evolve. I'm trying to read the chat. David, I'll try to process your comment there, but I think on the equity issue, I want to do two things. One, I want to pause in just a second and give others a chance to follow up on Connie's comment, either this particular session related to equity, or I noted another one that I wasn't able to attend that looked really intriguing to me, though. I was hoping one of you might be able to talk about it. And it's at the top of the second page of Kara's handout, called, I think it was on Tuesday, Systems Modeling to Integrate Health Equity into Implementation Science, Cultural Adaptation, but using a systems modeling approach to think about that. I was intrigued, but again, wasn't able to attend it. So in just a second, if anybody was, I'd love to hear kind of a synopsis about that. But first, let's just hear if anybody wants to directly follow up on Connie's sharing about that, that particular session. No, not hearing or seeing any. So then what about the one on the systems modeling? Was anybody able to attend that one? Nope. Okay. Well, we'll see. Maybe that's an issue we'll follow up on. I have to say that's something that, though I know not even enough to be dangerous about, but I'm very interested in the concept of applying different types of modeling to our work, implementation science in general, but maybe thinking about adaptation in particular. But David, I'm going to turn it over to you now to elaborate a little bit on your comment there, but I'm intrigued particularly about unintended consequences. To me, that's one of the key issues and potential advantages of a system science perspective. But I think thinking about, particularly about adaptation, about unintended consequences. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Hi, Russ. Yeah, it was just a thought. I think Kelly's comment was really intriguing, and it got me thinking. Both there's been so many massive changes in the healthcare system that have been really profit driven, but even related to health equity, thinking about the adaptations that are done in the name of health equity that and sometimes lead to reinforcing or making a health disparity worse. And so I guess this is kind of a quality improvement perspective of thinking about balancing measures or unintended consequences of, are your good intentions actually undermining the core functions or core capacity of a program over time? Something to add to the dynamic sustainability framework, I guess.
Mhm. Yeah, anybody, that really resonates with me. I'll just give you an example from our area in a minute, but let me see first if others want to comment on anything that spurs off David's observation or reflection there. Anybody?
Well, I can respond to you, David. I think that's why we need to push for more empirical testing. Like, it's not enough. People kind of stop at, we've done this wonderful community engaged process. It's culturally tailored, and look, it's still within the function of what it's supposed to do. And it's sort of, I think finding ways, if we can, to have a comparison, an empirical test that maybe just as good, but maybe that comparison stays more, true to fidelity, to the core components that were tested in the earlier RCTs. Or I just think generally the only way we'll really know about the unintended or intended impact of adaptation is to really challenge ourselves to push these things further into empirical tests on and if you can't study health outcomes, implementation outcomes. So are you really able to reach more people this way through in an equitable way because you've done this health equity upfront tailoring? Does that really result in greater reach or maintenance of the intervention, or what happens kind of down the road? I think that's really interesting, important.
Great comment. Also, sounds like I may need to apologize and keep turning my microphone on and off. I hope it isn't too bad, but we're having some construction done here in our house, some remodeling. So it's kind of loud for me, but I'm told it's not quite as loud for others. So when I'm not talking, I'll try to turn that off. But I really appreciate that comment, Kelly, and agree with you. I might just add one other thing from my own reflection when I think about, how do we really know something at the end of the day had an impact or not, or evaluating it. Other thing that I always look for, in addition to a direct test, if we can do that, is replication. Can you either replicate that yourself or at a different point in time or at a different setting, or maybe in particular another group or whatever. So that's a criteria that I think I look for and kind of combine with. I don't disagree with all with what you said. I just want to add one thing to David's comment that it looks like John, welcome, John, and I'll let you have the floor for a minute about your observations there. But just to be a bit concrete about some examples that David mentioned there about unintended consequences, using our own re-aim framework through my lens, often what we've seen is like really, really well-intentioned adaptations or even interventions, for example, that focus a lot on increasing effectiveness, RE there. One of the unintended consequences that they can have is either decreasing overall reach or creating some inequities in terms of who they can reach. And the issue is because of who has the time, who has the resources to do this, who has the support and that sort of thing. Again, often with the best intentions can create, that's just one concrete example that we've seen that can create a type of unintentional consequence. And I think of that as maybe a crude adaptation of systems science to some of our re-aim thinking about dimensions. So, John. John, I can't hear you. I think you might still be on mute.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Congrats, first of all, fantastic work and right on the forefront. And I'm so pleased that it's being profiled at this meeting. A sort of a general observation from my work is that some innovations, if not many, need continual adjustment to the context to make them relevant to their populations, especially in global health. There isn't a lot of research into the success or otherwise of those innovation programs where there is an infrastructure to support continual adjustment, or that looks at the capacity of the organizations to make those continual adjustments, and whether there's actually evidence of increased or continued effectiveness with continued adjustments, because some innovations are very context dependent and some aspects of the context are increasingly changing. I really should give some examples, but I'll stop there. I'm just very interested in people's thoughts about the idea of infrastructure and capacity for continual adjustment for a certain proportion of innovations.
Yeah. Thank you. That's great. I'll open it up here. I'd love others to comment on that, but I will just note there were a couple of things related to this issue of ongoing adaptations or adjustments there. One of them was a session that Borsika herself and colleagues were involved in, and maybe Kara can find that and put it there, that did talk about iterative adaptations and kind of adaptations over time. They were able to address part, not all of what you said there. And then the other one that is related, I think fairly closely, but not exactly on adaptations, but the issue of implementation strategies over time. Wynn Norton led a session talking about longitudinal documentation of strategies. And again, strategies change over time. And although I wasn't able to be there from knowing Wynn, I'm pretty sure what she might have talked about, or one of the things, was the use of a tracking device called lists that J.D. Smith has developed. And I can't, of course, remember what the acronym stands for, but it's, I think, longitudinal implementation strategies was part of it. So I might just call that out if you're multitasking like I'm trying to do, looking for other sessions, and if anybody went to that.
That's really helpful, Russ. My question really is focusing on what kind of support system or infrastructure may be most helpful to people to do that when and if it is necessary. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for clarifying and expanding. So comments, thoughts on that issue?
Well, it sort of gets to the capacity building, so are we as implementation scientists always trying to come in with our strategies for decades, or is it part of thinking ahead towards when you're with your partners around capacity building so that they have internal ways of, if adaptation is part of what you would expect over time for your intervention, especially in the health equity context, are there ways for us to build capacity at our partners so that they can do it over time in a systematic way where they're evaluated without us? Because likely if you're outside, you won't have, you won't be involved forever. And so that might get at the capacity building issue.
Yeah, we're doing a competencies that emphasizes it's implementation facilitator competencies, and it emphasizes that aspect. I suppose all I'm doing is highlighting it as a frontier area for research, because there's very little evidence in that area.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, thank you. Kelly's comment kind of cues off to me a reflection around, our various definitions of sustainability or sustainment. And certainly that's one of them. Rachel Shelton and others have talked about that one definition of it is not just sustaining the intervention or the intervention effects, but capacity that we have there to continue this. But I think that's, really well taken also. Let's see here. Where else? First of all, anybody else that hasn't had a chance to speak, please go ahead. And Kara, I'm wondering if you might try, the slide's been very helpful. And again, I'll encourage you to look at some of the prompts or topics there. But if you could quit sharing your screen for just a minute, we'll come back to it there. Thank you. Because that helps me to see everybody at the same time when I'm trying to look at what's going on. So please do use both your hand and then chat. I'll try to follow along with the discussion here. But let's see here. David entered another comment that resonated with Danielle anyway. So do one of you two want to elaborate a little bit on that?
I'll just follow up on my comment. Russ, I know you're involved in the economic evaluation group. That's kind of separate from this adaptation group, but it just seems like learning quickly about what works, what adaptations, what's cost effective, what's equitable. You kind of you need to be able to track the variation across sites and learn quickly, but it seems like the really tough aspect is how do you keep track of it? How do you monitor efficiently without crushing your research staff or your partners with really burdensome evaluation tools or strategies?
Yeah, great point. And I think that gets to, for those of you that use the Precis framework or whatever, to think about the pragmatism of research design and methods too. Separate to related to the intervention itself that you're doing or the burden of the implementation strategies, just the burden of the research. And certainly I think cost or economic analysis, doing costing, is a perfect example of that. And, maybe the perfect being the enemy of the good, because of course, ideally, we'd have observers in there and observe, every intervention that was done, which is never going to happen. And then secondly, we do some kind of time recording, which is held up as the gold standard. But in my experience, almost impossible to get people to do. Real world clinicians or staff that have 100 other things to do aren't going to do recording. So then that brings up issues. But I do think this notion of anticipating, not only assessing like the cost of, let's say, adaptations, since that's our focus today, the cost of adaptations, but maybe projecting those ahead of time too. So you don't engage in something that's really costly and maybe just not ever feasible or certainly not sustainable as we talk about that. My economist mentor on that, Deb Ritzwaller, likes to talk about replication cost. Both assessing those, but maybe even anticipating those ahead of time and thinking about, is this ever a cost? Realistically, knowing the resources that are available in the system kind of gets back to John's comment too about the system there. Is it ever feasible that you would ever be able to sustain, or anybody else, to replicate that given the high cost? Danielle, do you want to follow up? You had an initial response. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was just thinking about David's comment and working with this group at University of South Carolina on how to apply these methods to track adaptations to their intervention as it's ongoing. And they initially, when we proposed like the REDCap survey that Borshika's group developed, they were pretty overwhelmed with the number of items to track and felt like that was going to be too burdensome to do. So we Amy Hipschman and I put our heads together and figured out, okay, how can we lessen this? What are the most important things from this? And how do we get them to focus on ones that are tracking adaptations that we think are going to be relevant and ones that maybe won't be. But it's hard to know that at the moment. So it was a difficult process.
Absolutely. Adapting our adaptation methods. So,
Yeah.
I think critically important. Again, there's somewhat of a theme here, I think, going on about knowing the impact. There's both the intent of an adaptation and then the impact. And for me, one of the challenges is, well, first of all, it's just a tough thing to know, particularly if you don't have kind of real-time objective measures of that to know what the impact is, or direct comparisons, as Kelly said. But also, I think this temporal issue is really important, because it could well be that something either has a real delayed effect of an adaptation or can even kind of reverse itself. It may look really great for a while, and maybe, for example, trying to tie back in David's comment, maybe something that's pretty costly or burdensome for staff to do might be you get pumped up and you do that initially and it's really good, but again, you're not able to sustain that because of the cost, and so it may end up being either no help or even worse than where you started out that way.
Yeah, and the issue is the adaptations aren't occurring in isolation, and so to isolate the impact of the adaptation, I think, is really difficult to say.
Yep, of course, and again, to maybe make our task even impossible, going back to, I think David mentioned before, dynamic sustainability framework, but several of you commented on context, and context doesn't sit still either. And again, I think there were a number of talks on COVID. Some of you mentioned that in the chat here too, to think about that when context changes. And of course, that's often one of the driving forces or reasons why we need to adapt. But when it's changing and all the other things are changing, and maybe the intervention's changing out in these practical things, which are not research or controlled or real world there, it does make our work pretty darn challenging. So I'm trying to think, is there any other theme here? Either, again, people that haven't commented or other sessions, feel free now. Those of you that were there who have already added one thing. I'm not seeing signs or hands, and I don't think Borsika, kind of making sure she can enter in here too. She kind of was the brains behind this session or theme, but I don't think she's been able to join yet. But other comment or questions? Also, those of you that weren't able to go, any questions you have about like what you haven't heard talked about, or any other questions or comments you might have? What I'm a little surprised at, you've all been real good about talking about the content here, those of you that were there, but probably the biggest contextual factor for those of you that weren't there, I think for many of us, was the quote military occupation, or the incredible amount of security that took place at the meeting. Simultaneously, this was at the big convention center in DC, and simultaneously there was the huge summit of African leaders conference that was going on. And so there was security like I've never seen in my life. And just even getting in and out, was much more intensive than the usual airport security, and was just interesting. I believe there were even, some people told me, tanks out at intersections, armored personnel carriers, snipers on the roof, and it was just put an interesting spin on the meeting there. I think the other thing that I heard from people, and at least for me, part of the reason I didn't go to as many sessions as I usually do, was just this ability to meet in person and the networking. that was going on that we haven't been able to do for at least a couple years. So I heard that so much about having these type of conversations and catching up with people that you haven't seen and following up, on sessions that people went to and that sort of thing. I heard a lot of comments about that. Christina, do you want to see there launching a hybrid study and challenges? There was a session, I don't know if you were able to attend it or not, but I think it was a pre-conference session led by some of the folks doing work on hybrid designs and new things there. But anyway, why don't you go ahead and elaborate?
I really appreciate this. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I really appreciate this group, and just it's a little intimidating to hear of. Seems like all the studies are very advanced in terms of implementation. We are launching for the past year trying to launch, I guess you would call it a clinical innovation, which is basically a version of motivational interviewing that's been shown to work with Latinx heavy drinkers, and we're including Black or African American substance users into the trial as well. And from what it looks like, it's just hard to get the community health workers to do this. It's not hard, like they'll do it, but it's hard to just get everything going. And a lot of it has to do with, I think, the way the program is structured. It's under the Affordable Care Act. So there's a lot of pressure for the CHWs to do their work and to enroll more patients. And so, I've had a couple of more meetings to kind of get more buy-in. I think they say there is buy-in, but I think there's just a lot of burnout too. I mean, there's risk of burnout. So, I'm hearing these studies that seem to be going on really well. And I feel like we're just kind of hunkering along, we're gradually getting patients, but they're really technically, like with serious mental illness, they're basically the patients that we consider the exclusion category in a phase 2 trial. These are our patients. And I just have so many worries. I mean, implementation studies are very difficult. So I'm appreciating the audience and just saying, I think we're very much at the beginning part and learning. So I'd love to share what we have in terms of challenges, but I'm not sure if it would be helpful to the group. So that's where I am.
I think it might be, but maybe at a time, why don't we follow up on offline? And if you wouldn't mind emailing Karen Borsica and myself, we'd love to, and we could talk with you about a session. And that's a great example of one thing we want to foster. Like we're able to do that somewhat today, have this discussion back and forth around evolving issues and things. But again, from my own perspective, most of the time, somebody that says they have all the answers, is wrong. But I think sharing our challenges and our other approaches and what seems to be working or not is really valuable. So I think that would be a great thing to follow up on. But you kind of alluded to all these studies going on, doing great. I have to say, from my perspective, I haven't seen too many of those during COVID, certainly hardly any of our own that have. And, when you write things up in the publication, sometimes it looks quite a bit different than it was on the ground. But we've had to do, a huge amount of adaptation to everything there. And there's one article, I'll see if I can find it. I don't have my fingertips. My colleague, Jody Holtrup, who actually presented here not too long ago, wrote, and again, her context is family medicine or primary care, but just about the huge challenges during COVID of doing any research at all, and maybe some strategies and adaptations, and a number of those were just taking a pause, which maybe is impossible. But I do know from talking at NIH officers and things, I'd say 95% of the studies are behind timeline and things like that, and have to make some pretty drastic shifts because of this.
That's great to hear. And I'll share that I had spoken to my project officer at NIH, came clean, on our recruitment challenges. And what she said was, well, do your best. This is an implementation study. And as long as we know that you're doing your best, that's the whole point. But it's still hard, so anyways, thank you for the support. That's all I have to say.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, I want to save a minute or two. We've got a little bit longer, but I'd like to give Bob a chance here. Just entered into chat here about this issue. Let him elaborate a bit more, and we think we've got time for a little, at least brief discussion of this. But when you do an adaptation, it doesn't work as expected. Are there tools in particular that can help with redesigning, or the, I think, important issue we haven't explicitly talked about, one maybe important adaptation might be de-implementing something too. So Bob, do you want to elaborate a little bit, and then others chime in?
Yeah, thank you. I didn't attend, but I think one of the, for me, one of the things that I see happening, especially in most of our low and middle income countries, we're now talking about scale up, we're talking about adaptations now. And, without testing, like, it was mentioned earlier, without testing the adaptation, and investments are done to scale them up, for multiple years, then later you realize that maybe it wasn't even as effective, yeah? So are there tools that can, help development organizations, designers, programmers to test and kind of be sure that, okay, this doesn't work, maybe over a year, so de-implement this or stop this, don't invest in this, that's going, it won't have a lot of impact. So that key element, scaling in relation to adaptation.
Mm-hmm. Great question. Responses? People, anything either that you've seen that helps, or anything you're working on? That's another great thing to do, is just sharing. Anybody working on addressing that issue? Specifically a tool or a strategy to think about redesigning when adaptations, and I think pretty much all of us on this call have experienced that, at least in my case, seldom, if ever, do things work out perfectly that you thought about doing. And I think some very real challenges there, particularly given constraints. And maybe this goes back to some comments that Kelly and John made earlier about the context. And I think some of the challenges, even though I've done very little work in low and middle income countries, but given the incredible resource limitations and things that are possible there, just thinking about what adaptations, I think it does limit the range of potential adaptations you can do. But the notion of how to be systematic, myself, I don't know of any particular tool. And I guess I would say ours has been maybe a slightly systematic trial and error thing, starting out maybe conceptually based about what's the kind of model, or if you will, we've been talking about the function, the key thing you want to do, but then trying to track as frequently as you can what's going on, and then just informing that. But I don't know if anybody else does. Please chime in or put it in chat. But I don't know about a particular tool for that. Well, why don't we go back, as people are thinking, see if anybody would like to share one last thing. But, oh, David, why don't you go ahead, and then as he's doing that, Kara, why don't you share? We're coming up on the hour. Go back to the slides. I think we just have maybe one more slide that we want to share before, for the good of the order, before we close for today. But David?
Russ, it just struck me that I just think about the dynamic sustainability framework that you created with David Chambers and colleagues. And I think in a lot of our research studies, we kind of lose track of what the performance benchmark we're trying to either maintain or achieve. And just having kind of that North Star, if you will, as they say in quality improvement, to like evaluate, you know, whether you're getting performance improvements or decrements. You just don't see that a lot in the literature. And I think it's one of those aspirational things. I think in our reporting and our grant proposal standards, it would be nice to see, just to know that you're evaluating based on some level of quality, whether an adaptation is working.
Great point. Great point. Just thinking about Bob's question, I wouldn't call it a tool, but I think that kind of philosophical position you just talked about, David, about ongoing there. And then I'd come back to the other thing you mentioned earlier on, what the QI people call balancing measures too. So looking at this issue, not only what our primary objective is, but what might be balancing or unintended consequence. And again, I think for me, this form function has been quite helpful. And if anybody is much more, you're all much more facile than I am about technology, but if everybody can find the classic form function article to put in chat for Bob to put that link in there, I think, Bob, that's one thing that might be helpful, just to kind of keep in mind, related to what David said, what is the primary goal thing that you're doing here? And then how else can you do that if things aren't working well? How can you adapt that with strong leadership from the people on the ground, like whether they're like community health workers or what? So thank you all. Here's our last slide. Again, we would love to hear from you. If you haven't already, please let us know what suggestions you have for other things. We're open for February. We have a few ideas, but we'd love a volunteer. And then we do have this planned for March. But we'll close there. We're right at the top of the hour. So great seeing everybody, and have a great rest of your day and time until we meet again.